Hello and welcome to the Harvard Five Families Bible Study today. Today we are going to be looking at biblical criticism. Biblical criticism is one of those topics that is often misunderstood. People tend to think of biblical criticism because when we hear the word criticism, we tend to think of it in a negative way. And in some instances, biblical criticism is used like that. However, particularly biblical criticism is an attempt to deal with two different problems when studying the Bible. The first is dogma, and the second is bias. So, dogma is an official system of principles or doctrines of religion. And for a lot of religious people, those can be very difficult to have challenged. Which meant that when people came to studying the Bible and they discovered something in the Bible that maybe questioned or challenged these original dogmas, there was a tendency to side with the dogma. There is also bias. Bias is incredibly difficult to get away from in any kind of social science, which includes, in this instance, theology. Bias is the tendency of looking at something and seeing yourself, the things that have influenced you in your life, in your religious experience, and using that bias as a way of justifying what is actually going on in theology, rather than letting theology try to influence you. So biblical criticism tries to take a step back from those and to be actively aware of them. Of course, in some cases, as we will see, biblical criticism actively uses bias as a way of looking at the text, but we'll look at that towards the end of the video. So we have to begin somewhere. There are so many forms of criticism that I am just not going to be able to fit them all in this video. So instead, what I'm going to try and do is deal with perhaps the ones that you are most likely to encounter when doing any personal directed reading, or at least the kind of criticisms that we are probably going to be using when we approach the text itself, which is not far off now. We've done quite a lot of work on the ground, so we'll be able to dive into the text. So we're going to begin with textual criticism. Textual criticism examines the text itself and all associate manuscripts to determine this original text. Now, I use original text in inverted commas because in some cases I don't think that we're ever going to find the original text itself. When you're looking at, say, the book of Judges, which is written, in my view, around 1000 BC, so BCE, at least in its original form, the chance of those documents having survived to today is incredibly slim. Paper doesn't survive that long. If maybe some of these stories were carved into something more more long-lasting, like stone, then maybe we would find parts of it, but large texts carved in stone are incredibly rare. Now, I know we have things like the Baal cycle, and I know that Egypt stored a lot of their texts on walls, but Israel itself and Canaan before it was not a very large country, so there's not a lot of places to go looking. So textual criticism tries to find this original manuscript. And it works by doing this by identifying variants in the text. And this can be as simple as a word, or in Hebrew, a letter, because a letter, a dosh, a dat, or even in some cases a dot, can change the entire meaning of the word. So these two changes can have a big difference on the meaning of the text. These variants can come about for a whole variety of reasons. Perhaps the most common is a very simple mistake. It's incredibly difficult to copy out a text word for word and to not make a mistake. If you don't believe me, try it for yourself. Go open the book of Psalms and start copying. Especially when you need to make sure that this document is correct. And then see, do you cross out a line? Do you begin again? If you don't have the Psalms to hand, try then moving to a book that you are familiar with, that you know very well, and try copying it out. And what you will find is that your brain, rather than reading what's clearly on the text in front of you, will introduce what you think is there. And this can be as simple as commas or full stops. And in English, that changes the sense. In Hebrew, it can change the whole meaning of the thing. You've also got spelling mistakes. Very simple to do. We've all done it. Copying things out. Our brain wanders, especially if you've been at it for an hour or two. And we just make simple spelling mistakes. Even worse, if you're like me and you're dyslexic, you've got no hope. Or missing lines. Our brains, when reading text, it finds it very difficult to keep a hold of our place, especially if we're looking down and then looking up, looking down and looking up. And people can miss lines. And so you create this new text with these missing lines. In some cases, the missing lines are so obviously lacking that we know that this is a variant text. But in others, that missing line can actually change the whole sense of a paragraph. So we are then dealing with these very important changes. You also get changes that happen in text when we don't necessarily have a complete text. For example, when we were looking at the Qumran scrolls, a lot of them are fragmentary. So while we can work them out in order based on text we already have, we are relying on those existing texts to give us an example of how that should be. But of course, if we're looking at various texts of which we only have original fragments, it can be the fragments that can lead to these variations. Now, I know that some people out there are going to already begin to get a little panicky about the veracity of the document. But Kurt Aland, a biblical scholar, maintains that the New Testament, at least, is 62.9% variant-free, which, for an ancient document, is incredibly high. In our modern world, we would look at that and go, well, it's not 100%, it's not worth anything. But when compared to other documents, which tend to average somewhere down in the sort of 40s or 50s, 62.9% is an incredibly high number. So let's try and give you an example of what that would look like and where the problem comes about. So to do this, we're going to look at some text. And let me just move that over for you. So here we are looking at the text of Amos, looking at verse 6:12. It's a very famous verse when looking at textual variation. So let's read that. Do horses run on rocks? Does one plough with oxen? But you have turned justice into poison and the fruit of righteousness into wormwood. What? Let's just have a look at that. Does one plough with oxen? Well, yes, actually. Oxen was the beast of burden of the day. They were the tractors of the ancient world. So when asking, does one plough with oxen, the answer is, well, yes. So suddenly, we can see here that Amos 6:12 doesn't make any sense. Obviously, what the author here is trying to do is to use a rhetorical device, whereby they're asking questions to which the answer is obviously no. Do horses run on rocks? No, they don't. They're very bad on rocks. They'll fall, they'll break their ankles. So does one plough with oxen needs to have something else for it to make sense? When we begin to look at the variants of this text, we can see that one of the possible variations is that this line should read, does one plough the sea with oxen? To which the answer is obviously no. In the text, in some of the variations, it is a plausible translation of what we have. And suddenly the verse is making sense. Do horses run on rocks? No. Does one plough the sea with oxen? No. So you can get the rhetorical device working. This is what. Let me just move me back to how we were. This is what textual criticism is all about. Is finding these little tiny places and trying to find out how we make this text make sense. So moving on from textual criticism, we're going to look at something called source criticism. Source criticism is the acceptance of the idea that a lot of the texts have been edited together. Specifically, or particularly in this case, in the Old Testament, there's a move to try and find what this original source text might look like, and where possible, create them. There is also a movement in the New Testament, but we'll come to that later. The most influential hypothesis on an understanding of the Old Testament is something called Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis. Wellhausen suggested that the first 5 books, known as the Pentateuch, were created out of 4 separate sources: J, E, D, and P. J, which stands for Yahwist, because in German the J letter makes a Y sound, and if you can think, so that's where we get the J from. E, which stands for Elohist, D, which stands for Deuteronomist, and P, which stands for the priestly source. When looking at some of the Old Testament texts, we can see there being a pull between these different types of sources. For example, in Genesis, you will see God being referred to as both Yahweh and Elohim. And if you have a look at when we talked about how you know the name of God, you'll know that Elohim is probably the older name for God, which means that the sources that are still referring to God by using the word Elohim would make them older than texts which referred to God as Yahweh. So you're seeing already that there's a difference in the texts there. Then there are Deuteronomists who were, we believe, to be biblical revisers during a great political revival. The Deuteronomists got their hands on the texts and found that some of the texts were quite problematic when applying this new religious fervour. It's quite difficult to go back to these texts and change the contents of them, but adding gloss around them to kind of change the meaning of the text is very easy to do. And so the Deuteronomists are the ones that are adding this gloss. And in some cases, it's very easy to see. The priestly texts are those that talk about the importance of ritual and the importance of the place of the priest. Of course, the people writing that were considered to be priests, and because of this, it was referred to as the priestly source. And these 4 sources are kind of wrapped together throughout the 5 books of the Pentateuch. Now, it's quite difficult for us to unpack that here in this short introductory video, but one of the places where I think you can see the differences in 2 different types of text very easily is the book of Judges. And so we're going to have a look at one of my favourite stories from the book of Judges. And we are going to, if I can find the button, we're going to look at the story of Ehud in the book of Judges. So this is Judges chapter 3 verses 1 to 30, and I have included verses 31 there at the end, and we might touch on that in a moment. So it begins with this refrain: "The Israelites did again what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel, because they had done what is evil in the sight of the Lord. In alliance with the Ammonites and the Amalekites, he went and defeated Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. So the Israelites served Eglon of Moab for 18 years. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, son of Gera, the Benjamite. Now, just in this small piece of text, we have Deuteronomy kind of coming in. This top introduction gives the idea that the Israelites have done what is evil in the sight of the Lord. And if you go through the book of Judges, time and time again, this phrase reappears. And the reason we think that Deuteronomists have done this is that when you look at the story itself, God doesn't really take an action. So what is it that makes these stories biblical and scriptural if God isn't taking an action? So let's have a look at the story itself. Ehud is a left-handed man. Now, that's very important because at the time, left-handedness was considered to be a bit unusual. And later, of course, you know that left-handedness kind of falls out of favor, and there's a whole terrible history about the way left-handed people were treated because of it. But here, as the Bible often does, is the Bible denying a lot of the later abuses that are done in its name. So this left-handed man, the Israelites sent tribute by Ehud to the king Eglon of Moab. Ehud made for himself a sword of 2 edges, a cubit in length, and fastened it to his right thigh under his clothes. Now, this is important because it can only be drawn by a left-handed man. Most people are right-handed, and so the cloak would reveal that they weren't carrying a sword, and so he would be let in front of the king. Eglon is a very fat man. When Ehud finishes presenting the tribute, he sent the people who carried the tribute away, but he himself turned back at the sculpture stones near Gilgal and said, "I have a secret message for you, O king." So the king said, "Silence," and all his attendants went out from his presence. Okay, so he's alone in the room. Ehud came at him, and while sitting alone in the cool roof of his chamber, he said, "I have a message from God for you." So he rose from his seat. Then Ehud reached his left hand, took his sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into Eglon's belly. I love this description. The hilt also went in after the blade, and fat closed over the blade, so he did not draw the sword out of the belly, and dirt came out. Now that's just a vile image, but quite powerful. And then Ehud went out to the vestibule, closed the door, and locked the door behind him. Ehud escaped while they delayed, when he arrived, the sound of the trumpet on the hill country of Ephraim, the Israelites went down from the hill country, having him at their head. He said, "Follow after me. The Lord has given your enemies of the Moabites into the hand." So they went after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites and allowed no one to cross over. At the time, they killed 1,000 Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. No one escaped. The Moab subdued that day into the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. So in this story, we've got this bit where Ehud traps them. Now, what is missing, because I couldn't fit it onto the slide, is that they don't go in. The servants don't go in to see what's the matter with the king, because they thought he was using the toilet. And they thought this because of the smell. And as you can see, dirt came out. Now, in it, God doesn't take an action. Ehud says, I've got a message from God for you, but that is it. God isn't acting. And this, for the Deuteronomists, was quite a difficult thing to accept. So they gave it this gloss. And at the end of it, you kind of have this ending where the Israelites are strong, no one escaped, Moab is subdued under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. And if you go through the book of Judges, you will see this, the land had rest under this new saviour, and then almost immediately following, the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened, insert name of bad guy here, against Israel. It's kind of like a circle. And it's done intentionally to show this sort of descent away from God throughout the book of Judges. But when you start looking at the text, what you can begin to see, as Wellhausen pointed out, is that there are two different goals here. The middle is this incredible ancient story with this gloss that changes the meaning of the story. And just at the end there, we have got Shamgar. And I love this little story. It's not really relevant to what we're talking about today. But Shamgar, this is all we know about Shamgar. After him came Shamgar, son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. He too delivered Israel. And one of the reasons that this remains is the story of Shamgar had become so famous that they couldn't remove it. But they remove quite a bit of the other stuff. So that he doesn't get all of the story like Ehud. He doesn't get any kind of glory, just this remaining line. And it's a really interesting line, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to it. And if you want to know more, please do get in touch and we'll talk more about Shamgar. But let's move on from our source criticism and have a look at the New Testament synoptic problem, which is, of course, another synoptic, which is another form of source criticism, but deals with a different problem. In the New Testament, the first three books as we have them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all have incredible similarities between them. And there's a lot of debate about how these similarities came into being. The first attempt was by kind of creating this very complicated idea about a source known as Q. And let's see if I can give you the diagram here. Okay, so we have here M, which is the M source, which is the stuff that's in Matthew that doesn't appear anywhere else. We've got the source Q, which is in Luke, that also matches with Matthew. We have got the sources that are in Mark that message with Matthew and with Luke. We've got Proto-Luke, which is where the sources of Q and this original Luke source here is changed slightly so that the sources of Q in Matthew and Luke don't always match. So they are in Luke. And then we've got the Antiochian document, which forms kind of the intro of Matthew, and the document of infancy, which forms some of the part of Luke. And this is such an incredible and complicated theory to explain why Matthew and Luke have similarities. Now, this comes about because Mark was considered to be the older document, with Matthew, the younger document, with Matthew being the older, then Luke, then Mark. And that's why we've got them in the order that we have in the Bible. That Matthew comes first because it was the first document. So you then need to sort of say, well, how Matthew and Luke were written roughly at the same time. How did they know about each other? Well, they had Q in front of them, so they were able to copy from each other. Mark had Matthew and Luke in front of him, so he was able to copy from Matthew and Luke to be able to produce Mark. It gets so incredibly complicated that you then need to begin to introduce other sources, like Proto-Luke, to try and explain why the stuff in Luke doesn't exactly match the stuff in Matthew, even though they should know about each other. It's just more thinking. And we come to this theory, which is the two-source hypothesis, which in variation is where most people end up today. By moving Mark to being the original source, the older document that we have, and there's a lot of evidence for why Mark should be the earliest, starting with the fact that Mark is a very quick document. There's not a lot of fluff in it. There's a lot of stuff in Mark that's quite difficult to explain. And normally when you're copying something, so if Mark was copying Matthew, you wouldn't make things difficult to understand. What you would actually do is make them easier to understand. Whereas if you posit that Matthew has copied from Mark, Matthew explains stuff that in Mark is quite difficult to understand, which would make sense if you're copying a difficult document. Then you can say, well, Matthew and Luke have Mark in front of them, and therefore the bits that match between Matthew and Luke that also match Mark is because they just copied from Mark. If you then need to argue for the stuff that is the same between Matthew and Luke that isn't in Mark. And for some people, they posit this Q hypothesis, keeping it from the earlier hypothesis, but Q can also be essentially removed by saying that Luke copied from Matthew. So Mark comes first, then Matthew. The stuff that matches in Luke that matches Matthew, Luke copied from Matthew. And each source, if you can have a look, you've got that tiny green bit at the end and that tiny blue bit, is original material. That's material that Luke had access to and chose not to copy bits of Matthew. And Matthew had sources that Mark chose not to use. I find it much easier than trying to posit a Q document, sort of this full, complete document that we don't have. But this is the source theory that is most often talked about. And you can see by doing this, by looking at the sources, we begin to discover new things about the text. We begin to understand that Mark was the first document, and that changes how we might understand it and how we might read it. If Matthew is seeking to explain Mark, then we've already got a development in the communities that are dealing with these books, and Matthew is speaking to those communities to try and expand and understand it. We've also got Luke, who intentionally says, I am going to try and do my best to gather everything I can about what was written by Jesus. So it would make sense for Luke to gather Matthew and Mark and anything else he could to try and put together his document. So already looking at the source and trying to remove our bias from it, we begin to find something new and interesting about those documents. So we are also seeing here how this is impacting on our theology and how we understand these texts. Because if we know the order in which they were made, we can say bits and pieces about how we understand them, how that community affects, how in the date in which they were written, these events would have happened. And we can say, well, obviously, this event, this person is writing about it because they know about it, or this person is writing as this event is happening in real time. So the detail hasn't really come out. There's a whole real interesting exploration that we can do when we do that. Source criticism obviously looks at a whole bunch of sources, not just the ones that I've outlined. And so you're going to see it applied all through the Old Testament and all through the New in various and different ways. Now, we're already beginning, just by touching on those, to run out of time. But I do want to just very quickly mention that there are other forms of criticism, like literary criticism, where literary criticism looks at taking the book as we have it and tries to look at what is the author trying to make you think, what is the author trying to make you understand. It's called rhetorical criticism, looking at the use of language and the way in which arguments are outlined. Very useful when looking at the arguments of St. Paul, who is a rhetorician. He sets up arguments and then knocks them down to prove his point. It's a very rhetorical way of talking. Then you have narrative criticism, which looks at the impact of the story. What is the story as a whole saying? And of course, you can break that down to little bits of the Bible called pericope. But looking at the narrative of the story. What in here is going on? And there are, of course, criticisms like reader response criticism, where what is the reader getting out of this? What is, when I read these texts, what is my response? And how does that impact what I'm looking at? And you can remember way back at the beginning I spoke about bias, and here in reader response we're getting the use of the bias but accepting it and trying to look at how that bias might impact how we're reading the text. And we go on from there to some contemporary methods. So social criticism, postmodernism, feminist literary criticism, LGBT criticism. And all of these are taking these specific examples and looking at the text. For example, feminist criticism, led by people like Phyllis Tribble, Elizabeth Schusler Fiorenza, Rosemary Radford Ruather, are looking at the text and looking at how females are silenced in the in the Old Testament, looking at how the voice of women particularly is silenced throughout the Old Testament. And you see this in ways where women aren't necessarily given names. In one of the stories in the book of Judges, the main character is kind of Japheth and his daughter, and Japheth's daughter doesn't get a name. She's just referred to as Japheth's daughter all the way through. In other places, we see how the role of women is almost kind of placed underneath. Again, in the book of Judges, we see Deborah, one of the first judges of Israel, an incredibly powerful and strong woman in her own right. In fact, that first story in the book of Judges is all about the power and the intelligence of women. And the gloss of the Deuteronomy basically removes Deborah as having any kind of power, any kind of place in the history of Israel. And if you look at some of contemporary theologians, they almost deny the fact that the Bible clearly says Deborah was a judge over Israel. They just deny that as a fact. So feminist criticism deals with this kind of creeping masculine bias and deals with some of the really hard stuff that happens to women. And we're talking sexual trauma, we're talking body trauma, we're talking physical trauma and mental trauma, and kind of raises our understanding of what actually is going on here. Same with LGBT plus criticism, which looks at the way in which voices of same-sex love have been silenced. LGBT criticism would look at the relationship between David and Jonathan and say that the way in which these two men interact with each other explores and expands a same-sex understanding of love. They would also look at the story of Ruth and actually see that there, the man is essentially almost secondary to two women gaining a child and keeping their family dynasty going. And these kinds of lenses to look at the Bible really does kind of open up some of the stuff that the text is dealing with. I've often said in my studies of approaching the Bible that the moment you say, well, the Bible says X, somewhere in the Bible there is its own criticism of X. So whatever that is, somewhere in the Bible is intentionally dealing with that in a different way. Because it's about people, and people are messy, people are different, and people, despite let's take for example the story of Esther. Women constantly being referred to as having no power. Esther walks into an enemy camp, chops the head off the leader, the bad guy, and sticks it on a spike. Just to kind of prove, actually, the women can be warriors, and all the men are cowering in the castle, and she's the one that goes and gets stuff done. So you kind of see these all the way through, and these criticisms let us look at the Bible in new ways. A lot of the new forms of criticisms can almost be seen as lenses. So taking an intentional stance, LGBT plus, feminism, and looking at the Bible through that lens and asking, what does the Bible say when I look at it intentionally through this lens? Now, we talked about lenses when we talked about reading the Old Testament through the lens of the New. Here we're using criticism as an intentional lens to read the Bible. Now, not a single one of these criticisms stands on its own. They don't say the whole thing, but they are vitally important to growing our understanding of the Bible. And by looking and exploring all of them, even the criticisms you disagree with, there is always something that you're going to learn, because it allows you to see how these texts are impacting people today in different ways, how they might have impacted the first people that heard them, how they might be impact people in the way in which they apply them in their daily life. And all of these things are vitally important in the modern world, where this is a live debate. The way in which we are looking and reading the Bible is impacting people's lives today. Feminist criticism, LGBT plus criticism, black criticism, all of these things are helping us see what the Bible is truly wanting to say. From a theologian's perspective, who comes with, in my case, an intentional bias towards the existence of God and the person of Christ, these criticisms which help me be aware of what Jesus is saying. How does this text look when you remember that Jesus is a black person? I, as a white person, aren't going to understand the oppression and the lack of privilege. Black criticism, looking at the life of Jesus and seeing his oppression by a sort of a structured regime oppressing Jesus as a black person, has incredible and powerful things to say in the modern world, with, for example, Black Lives Matter being something that right now is impacting on people's lives and has impacted on people's lives for generations. And it's only now that that criticism is really being heard. This stuff is very important. It might sound dry, and if you try reading some of these books, they are incredibly dry. They are written by people with a passion who are so intent on getting it right that they can lose the ability to just communicate what they're trying to say. So that's my overview of biblical criticism. And as you've already begun, we're already over time on this video. So we haven't touched in depth on a whole range of postmodernism, social criticism, feminist literacy, historic criticism, psychological biblical criticism, dogma criticism, all of that. We haven't even touched on it. But you now know what a criticism is, and it is a way of dealing with text, and we've dealt with some of the more important ones. We will, as we read through the text, we will be using these criticisms sometimes without even being aware that we're doing it. And often when we're reading the text, we will be weaving different forms of criticism in as we go, which will impact how we're reading them. And I don't want you to think that this is all just sort of one big barrel of criticism, but comes from a whole bunch of work by scholars who have focused individually on a single point of criticism. My role here is to try and help guide you through our understanding of the text and to open it and help you understand, and hopefully have a bit of fun as we move on. Where are we? So thank you very much for joining us. We'll get used to not pressing the wrong button. Thank you very much for joining us. And I know this has been quite a difficult video. If you've got any questions, please do drop us a line on Twitter, or of course over on Facebook, and that's the other way around. Pop into our website and see how we're doing. Or of course catch up with these videos over on YouTube if you've missed a video and you really want to go back and see what's going on. Remember, these videos are produced because I enjoy doing them. I love making these videos. They've been a great source of joy during this pandemic. But of course, I work for churches, and they function only on donations. And churches, of course, are a vital part. At least, obviously, I believe that. I'm a priest, in helping and support the community, especially during this pandemic, offering support and care and help in ways in which not necessarily our political class has chosen to do. So if you do want to help support our mission to supporting people through this difficult time, please do consider sending us a donation, and you can do that through PayPal or by Gift Direct. This money does not go into my pocket. This money goes into supporting the mission of the church in my local area. So please do consider doing that. If you don't have any money, don't worry about it. Hopefully these videos are done, and as long as I'm able to do them, which as church is beginning to open up, I'll try and carve out time to do them, because I've enjoyed them. I've still got a whole bunch more to go about and say. Hopefully you've enjoyed them, and whatever you've done, however you've watched this video, it's been informative and I've helped you understand. So whatever you're doing, look after yourselves. Remember, even though lockdown restrictions are easing, please, please, please stay safe. Wash your hands. Stay 2 meters apart. Wear a mask. Stay safe, and where possible, stay home. Look after yourselves and go with God. Amen.